Today our topic is the disparities of preservation. And I have an extremely informative guest today, Dr. Georgette Grier-Key. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I'm fine.
Okay, we're good. So we've talked prior about the importance of the preservation of a lot of buildings, especially African American buildings. But there seems to be an inequality of the distribution of funds. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit on our experience with that?
Yeah, well, you know, to me, preservation is so very important. And preservation specifically in the built environment to make sure that we see our history in the physical realm as well, not just in documents. And a lot of the times, too, our history isn't present in the documents. I think we have a duty when we discover a physical building and a place, or even if it's not a building and it's just land, that we have an equal duty to preserve it. With that being said, presently we're underway of trying to preserve the Pierce Concert Homestead, the home lot, which is at 51 Pond Lane.
And that's in?
Southampton, New York, in the heart of the village. And it has been quite a struggle with trying to preserve it. One can just Google 51 Pond Lane or the name Pierce Concert.
And could you spell that for us so people can? P-Y-R-R-H-U-S.
That's right.
Last name C-O-N-C-E-R.
Yes. And that name is a name that is that is of a cultural ambassador, not just for Southampton or for Long Island, but he is a global icon.
Absolutely.
And so when you think about what he has done, and the fact that his name is not really so much recognizable in our local school and education system, we're looking to change that, and having his physical building will help us do that.
And during that time, being that we're going to, think about the disparities of the preservation, I want you to share how, they didn't look at that building. That building should have been historically designated. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. And they look at the criteria for preservation in different ways. And I know we discussed with African American sites the qualifications or the criteria is different. So,
well, when you look at these historically ways of quantifying different structures, when you look at whether it's in archaeology or whether it's in architectural, they look at, there is different qualifications, whether you are a cultural historian, whether you are a historical archaeologist, there's different ways of looking at things. And part of the reasons they use different tools to measure. For instance, when you look at traditional architecture, they look at different measures. Well, is it a Greek revival? What kind of historical elements are we looking at? And for the most part, we know Pierce Concert, he was born of meager means. He was born after July 4th of 1799, which constituted him being born technically free to an enslaved mother, which gave him the status of being born as an indentured servant, which we do not make a difference for in slavery in this region, because then we see that he was sold into slavery. So we know that he did earn his freedom eventually, but his life was very different. So he did not have the means to build a grandiose house with the traditional architectural things and elements that people would look at. When we think of in terms of a historic district, this is a planning tool that would come into being in the 1970s, where you would have probably more than likely novice or students that were looking for a summer job. They would go around to different communities and look at houses and say, oh, well, this looks like the elements that we're learning, that we're drafting in school. It has these obelisk or these columns that we're looking for, these pane windows that we're looking for. So elements that they will be learning and looking for European models, and not the makeshift meager means that someone who were of maybe a lesser society type of upbringing would have, that they would have made this by their hand.
Right.
So when they saw this house that probably didn't look like something they would value, they didn't put it down. Although he was still within the bounds of, the home lot was still within the bounds of a historic district, it was not added as a contributing house. But we know in the 80s, and you can talk about that because you were part of that, that there was a contingent of people that came over from Japan that honored him, and there was a monument. So we knew that he was of importance. Not only did we know he was of importance, there was so much documentation of his triumph from being born into indentured servitude to actually, leaving this life as a philanthropist and leaving a lasting legacy that is still in existence as a scholarship for widowed wives of seamen. So, I mean, his legacy was well in the documents of the Southampton Village Presbyterian Church and that of the Southampton Village government structure. So the fact that his home would be able to be torn down in this day and age was absolutely absurd to the surrounding communities that help and contribute to the community. I will also say that in most of the government structures, as far as zoning laws, it says that if someone of significance as well as cultural standing lived in this house, it could also be considered a landmark status, and that the charge of these ARB, which is the Architectural Review Board, has a duty to also call and ask for this house to be added. So it's not just that when we come as community residents before these boards to say, I want to add something to my house. They also have a duty to, from time to time, examine the historic district and say, you know what, we need to do an evaluation and see if we've overlooked anything or has something changed. So it is a charge, and as a certified local government, which Southampton Village is to do its due diligence, to go back over the rolls and see if something has been excluded, was it overlooked, or should we just take another look?
Well, it was, the fact of the matter was it was overlooked. Let me just say that out and out. And the other fact of the matter that it was shared with me, I'm trying to stay positive and stay in the light.
Yes.
But the fact of the matter is, it was told to me by a great source that they had hired, like you had mentioned, they had hired someone's son to do a summer job. And I was told that they were literally, some people just, holding up their hand and said, make my house historical, put my house on the list kind of thing. And the other thing that I just want to expound on, and maybe you can add to this, is people even think that there were slaves in the North. I mean, we could have a whole nother show on that. But I don't even know, even today, whether or not it's even acknowledged, especially the fact that where his house is located, it's in a high-end area where, without getting into details of the whole story of how all this transpired, that they felt that that house was insignificant to the point where they rather had just take the house off it and sell it for amount of money to, have somebody build a big mansion on it. So those are things that I think that we also can bring up about how there has to be authority, somebody in authority to support our backings and support the significance and the importance of this man. And that's where we've had our challenges. And as time go on, I think we're still having issues with preservation. And besides the Pierce concert, what were some of the other African American sites that you might have thought of that might have had these kind of identification issues?
Well, there are many. When you think about Long Island as a whole, and you think about where many of the AME Zion churches are, for example, the Workers' Progressive Administration, at that time, they actually hired surveyors to go around and take a look at where all of the African American churches were at that time. If you look at most of them that are over 96 years or 100 years old, and you look at where these churches are present day, a lot of these churches are in communities that really don't have a presence of African Americans. And why do you think that is? So places like Quag, places like in Setauket, where there are still sometimes the parishioners are still going back to these churches because, that's where their home is. But many of them don't live there because either they're priced out or because they moved on. So there are quite a few on eastern Long Island and for that part up in the middle part of Long Island where these churches exist. For instance, there is up in Mount Sinai area, the Betty Prince site, where there was a major highway that came through and the collections for that.
And where was that located again?
Mount Sinai.
Wow.
It's actually 25A, Miller Place, Mount Sinai Historical Society. There is a marker there. But the collections that was actually archaeological dig was there. It's in the New York State Museum. They actually have the artifacts that was dug up from there. And you can really understand the dynamics of that. There was a homestead there that was owned by the woman that was there, Betty Prince. She was actually listed on the census as head of household.
Really?
So there is research there, and you can actually go on the Long Island Journal and find out that there was a paper there that was documenting all of that information. So even through archaeology, you can learn, and of course, we've done archaeology at the Pyrrhus Concert site, which also gives you another window into history of these sites and what it meant at these different sites. So throughout Long Island, there's various history, and sometimes the history is not complete. When you look at documentation, sometimes the track is cold. So when you look at the history of Long Island and its relationship to slavery, preservation is really important to us because the record is not always complete. And so when we do have an opportunity to preserve these sites, it's very important because, like you said, a lot of people think about slavery not being in the North, and because we, as the North, got to write the narrative, and we wrote it in the favor of how we wanted to be basically observed by the rest of the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's a timing right now with the 1619 that came out in New York Times. And can you tell us a little bit more how important that is right now, that we're living in this time with the 1619? Could you, just people who might not understand or have not, everybody should have known about 1619, but if they haven't, could you just give us just a little bit of information of how that was brought out at this time?
Yeah, well, the 1619 era is right now, this is the year that we're commemorating the first time that enslaved Africans were brought to the American shores of Virginia. And so, but for us, it's really important for us to celebrate and commemorate that, but also commemorate it in a way that it's place-based, where it did happen here. Slavery happened here on the East End, on Long Island, in Suffolk County. So not just that we're commemorating that time that it happened there, but it happened here. And the first time we can commemorate that in Suffolk County is in 1654 when we think about Sylvester Manor, which is now Sylvester Manor Education Farm on Shelter Island. So, and even when you think about East Hampton, you think about Southampton. So Long Island as a whole, it's not that it just is so far away from us. Place-based, what does that mean for us? 1619. What does that mean for New York? What does that mean for Long Island? Yeah.
Yeah, and I really want to expound more on the 1619, but for the most part, the most important thing that I think that we want to drive into, besides the disparities of the preservation, is the fact that perhaps that's not well talked about or really acknowledged because they don't want to even acknowledge that there was even slaves here. I mean, like you mentioned about how the significance when you have certain laws, if an important person is in a house. Matter of fact, that's kind of how me as executive director of the Southampton African American Museum, I pulled out part of that legislation where small part of that legislation said that if it was significant to the community. And that's what I pulled out in order to make Southampton African American Museum the first African American site to be historically designated. But these are things that if it weren't for you and I advocating for these things, like our history, it's brushed under the table, it's not talked about. So, we have a thing now that says it's time for us to tell our story. So what do you think that we can do now to correct some of these inequalities?
Excuse me. Well, I think the most thing that is important today in terms of what's going on today, it's all connected. Slavery is not something so far in the past, and I think people don't understand. You hear a lot of statements like "just get over it," and people don't understand that slavery is so connected to today. One thing that I talk to my students about, I ask them, "Is slavery over?" And some people, I ask them, and I say, "This is not a trick question. We're going to have a debate because I am all for active learning and inquiry." And so people raise their hand. We split the room and we actually go into a debate. And then I say, "Okay, let's look to what is actually in the 13th Amendment." Because a lot of times they don't even read it. And we take out a real copy, a nice copy of it, and then they get to the part where it says, except for if you are
convicted of a crime.
That's right. And so what does that mean, right? And then we go to the penal system, and it looks like how many people are wrongfully convicted, or how many people are disproportionately, depending on if you have melanin in your skin, or if you are poor, right? How many people are wrongfully in a situation, and so now they are subject to slavery according to our own laws. So depending on where you are, is slavery outlawed? Then the other thing is, then we look at which states outruled slavery first. And then they're so surprised to find out how late Connecticut really, outlawed slavery. So then, because you know what, we have to really let the students, which we say are the future,
absolutely,
really understand how slavery permeates in today's society. Then, I go to the street signs, because when I was growing up, this was a big thing. I'm of the hip hop generation where stop hanging on the corners. Well, where does the no loitering sign comes from? Where does that come from?
That has a history that people don't really,
they really
don't know.
Understand the slave
so break
codes,
it down, break it down.
So we look at the slave codes and the slave laws, and where did these come from? What about the congregating? Even today, 3 or more congregating together, where does that come from? Well, when there was time for meetings at cemeteries for enslaved Africans, they didn't want them gathering 3 or more at the cemetery site, right? And after dark, dawn to dusk. So when you start to show them that where all of these things came from in slavery, right? So when you look at all of these things that are living with us today, where did they come from?
Absolutely.
Right? So and even just the disparities, right? And how one of the things, the lessons that really got to me is from slavery down to Civil War to Reconstruction, a young lady who came from the Caribbean, she couldn't understand contraband. Right?
She was one of your students?
One of my students.
Okay.
And this, she just could not consider how a person, and this is how you have to really, what is contraband? She's like, they think contraband is something illegal, it's in your pocket.
Exactly, exactly.
Could not understand the concept that a person could be considered contraband. So, again, it's the responsibility of educators. And again, thankfully, we're in New York, so our museums, we are an extension of the education system. And it's the responsibility of us to teach.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, slavery is just like one of those things. And the most misconception is that most people who are non-African American, that have not experienced, not everyone could afford slaves. So let's just get that off the table.
Exactly.
So everyone, and the other thing is, this is not about guilt.
It's not.
You know, people, this conversation should not be about guilt.
Absolutely.
And when we talk about slavery, we should not automatically go to reparations, because what that allows is for us to erase that it even happened.
Exactly.
This is a
Exactly.
conversation that has to happen. Before we can, yes, reconciliation has to happen before we can go to reparations. Reparations is a necessary conversation that needs to happen in a real way.
Absolutely.
But how can we go to that without talking about truth and reconciliation and acknowledgement that slavery happened in this country, and that, for one, my ancestors, of course, definitely built this country, and that are probably more American than a lot of people who claim to be American, because we definitely fought in this country in every war. And the fact that we contributed to this country, but of course, most people don't recognize our contribution. And like you said, you're born and raised here in Southampton, and you get asked the oddest questions. So there needs to be a truth and reconciliation. And you know what, how we were raised? If you don't have anything nice to say, you don't say it. You know, what about adding this? You know, but we kind of try to say, no question is a silly question. But you know what? Sometimes we have to use common sense and crack a book.
Absolutely.
Because we have to start having factual conversations about slavery.
We have to.
And it has to start with the school.
You know, I think I mentioned to you, and first I want to condemn, I'm trying to get the word now. I want to acknowledge that Southampton High School, the public are trying to do something, because I came to their school and I want to ask them to include Pierce concert in their local history. And it's been 2 or 3 years now, and they're working on it. And like I said, I'll give them a lot of credit for that. But it was very, very interesting. I followed back up constantly, because you know we have to do that. And the last time I met with them, which was a couple of weeks ago, it was interesting. She was very honest with me. She said, you know, we really can't even move forward with even implementing this. She said, because the teachers are still uncomfortable talking about race. So instead of actually, I think they're putting it in the local curriculum, but right now she's looking at now how she's going to set up these workshops and all these seminars and all these things to prepare the teachers to teach about race. You know, like I said, I'm glad this is happening. I'm glad we're having a conversation, but it was very telling. At least she was truthful about it. But that's very serious about how people are uncomfortable talking about race.
But that's the problem. It's not a feeling. And you know, and when we grew up too, this is the other thing. In my family, everyone's not getting a trophy. And if they
hello, could you say that? Wait, hold up. Could you say that one more time?
In my family, everyone is not getting a trophy, because you know, you have to teach. This is honest. You have to teach how to deal with disappointment.
Absolutely. Because
you know what? If you don't teach that earlier on, there's going to be problems. You have to teach. Try again.
Absolutely.
I mean, I hear those songs, never get up, never give up, keep trying, keep trying, because it's not about a feeling.
And that's so key.
Race is not about a feeling. Slavery is not about a feeling. And like I said, this is not about guilt. It's not about guilt.
Right.
And as soon as we get past that, I think we can have a real conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And we'll be able to get a lot further about this stain. And people will be able to appreciate what everyone has contributed to this country, which we all love.
Absolutely.
And again, the whole story, which I feel, and I always have the responsibility of telling the whole history of this country, and it's not my job to rewrite it, it is to tell it like it is. And if everyone took that position and stopped going to these houses, and you know, you go to these beautiful houses and you see part of the story, it's like, you know, I'm like the worst tour guide. Because it's like you go and you're like, wait, there's something missing here. You know, so whenever my family goes with me to a tour, You know, like, no, we don't want, we'll go and take the audio because we're going to know the real history of this house or of this community without even it being said, because there's no way that this house took care of itself,
Right,
especially
right.
at this time period.
Right, right.
There's no way, you know? And I think we're better off that way if we tell the whole story.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're almost down to a minute, believe it or not. And I'm going to read this quote by James A. Baldwin, and I think this is going to end our show today. It says, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. Well, Dr. Georgette Grier-Key, I'd even expound on all your wonderful, what you're involved with. We have like 30 seconds. Could you just tell us really some of the things I'm supposed to do at the beginning of the show, but we're going to end the show with telling us all the wonderful things that you're involved with, and that's how we're going to end the show.
Well, I think I am involved with making sure that the history of Long Island the history of many of the wonderful accolades that Pyrrhus Concert has done, along with others, is going to be preserved for now and forever.
Excellent, excellent. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for viewing VOW, Voices of Wisdom, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.